Hi, everybody. Now about space and shape. Let's look at some slides. So, shape and space are interrelated, and we want to think of shape in two different ways. We've got geometric shape, which would be hard edge shape, angular shape. Geometric shape is generally what humans make. So the things we make are generally geometric. We do make some organic shapes, and most of the shapes found in nature are organic, so that means curvilinear and irregular. Some natural shapes, like those found in nature, though, are geometric, like crystalline structures. Space, the available area, or even the air of a work. And if we take the term at its broadest, space is the indefinable general receptacle of all things. Continuous, infinite, never present. It could be, but for our uses, we're thinking of the page as the space available. The canvas is the space available. So visual arts are called the spatial arts. The elements are arranged in space. In contrast, music is a temporal art because musical elements are organized primarily in time. And film, video, and dance form is organized in both. So we've got positive and negative shape in space. And here, positive space means the figures in the sculpture. And so they pop out from the background. Whereas negative space feels like the background, it's the non-positive space. So we see it behind them, we see it through their arms, and so on. Also called the ground. So some artists have used a combination of positive and negative space and their confusion to make interesting art. And here are Escher prints that use that same idea. This ambiguous morphing ground and figure and ground relationship. And architects are concerned with space, obviously. When we approach a building, we see it first as a shape within the space of the world. But when we go inside, we're experiencing a sequence of volumes as we walk through the architecture. And we can create the illusion of three-dimensional space within two dimensions. If you've noticed before, a lot of ancient art has a really shallow space. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of depth to it. It will utilize some overlapping, though, and that is the first step in trying to make three-dimensional space. So you can see that overlap causes some objects to feel like they're in front of, and some objects to feel like they are behind. Diminishing size is where you have things that are close to you be large, and things that are further away are smaller and smaller. And then vertical placement. This is the idea that objects that are low in a scene feel like they are closer to us, and objects that are high feel like they're further away. So the most effective way to create three-dimensional space is to use all of these. We've got overlapping happening here on the right, and here we've got overlapping and diminishing size and vertical placement really happening all at once. This is a Bonnard painting on the right and a Van Gogh painting on the left. So vertical placement is also called foreshortening. And foreshortening also implies diminishing size as well. And note the atmospheric perspective here that we talked about atmospheric perspective when we were talking about value. I really don't like this painting. I only have it here because it's a good example of vertical placement. You can see that the goldfish bowl feels very close to us because it's down low, whereas this globe or whatever it is up at the top feels like it's far away. Here again, we've got everything happening all at once. And just a few more notes about atmospheric perspective. A lot of times, watercolor paintings are a good way to see atmospheric perspective. An atmospheric perspective works with color as well as value. Warm colors tend to advance, cool colors tend to recede. We've got that high contrast in the foreground and less contrast in the distance, sharper edges in the foreground, blurry edges in the background. So if we put space and shape together, we've got some theories on how they work together and how they operate in our brain. These are called Gestalt. And Gestalt was developed in the 1920s, Gestalt theory, and describes how our minds organize what we see. And it's rooted in psychology. Psychology as a science really started to come into its own in the 1920s, especially in Germany. Um, these theories are all interrelated. Usually we see more than one happening at a time. And the first we'll talk about is similarity. This is simply the idea that when we see objects that look alike, we tend to group them together. So we're reading this as two statues of liberty in one space. Things that don't look alike stick out. They're called anomalies. Anomaly is a way to add interest to a work. If you've got a large area of shapes that look similar, and then a small anomaly, the anomaly will stick out, but it won't overwhelm the scene. Then we've got continuation. It was the idea that our eyes will follow lines without any actual lines to follow. So we can see this star that appears to be swooping through the word space, but there's no actual line behind the star. It's just simply cut out space from the word space. Continuation also is what might make us read these two lines as crossing each other. But it's just as logical for me to say that this is four lines coming together at a point. This is what's happening when we see dashed lines. So we read that as one continuous line. We don't see it just as a series of squares or rectangles. It's also happening when a line goes beneath an object. We will read it as going beneath. When it's just as logical to say that the line goes to the square and ends and comes out of the square as another segment. We read it as one continuous line. This also works, dashed lines also work with arcs and curved lines. Closure is very closely related to continuity. So this is the idea that our brains will fill in spaces and shapes where there really isn't any. So there's no line indicating the top of the bear's head, but our brains will read it as a closed-in circular space. Same thing with the back of the bear. Proximity. This is the idea that objects that are really close seem to be grouped. Objects that are disparate and far away do not seem grouped. It's why even though when we have separate shapes, they seem to be together. So this flame uses proximity and continuation especially to feel like it's one object. That figure-ground relationship again, we tend to read positive space first and then look at the background. And this is closely related to pregnance theory. This is the idea that we'll pick out images from clouds. We'll see faces even where there aren't any. And it's related to evolution, really. It's a part of us wanting to see the world as ordered. It's also very useful. You might want to be able to pick out a tiger from the background if you're in the jungle. Symmetry and order. We tend to read symmetrical objects or shapes as ordered and making sense. So we'll find symmetry a bit more static than non-symmetrical scenes. When something is not symmetrical, we usually find it dynamic. If we see something that is symmetrical, our brains will then start to check it. We'll make sure it's symmetrical. So when we first saw this image, it probably looked symmetrical. But then when we start to check it, we can see it's not perfectly the same from right to left mirrored. So here they are: similarity, continuation, closure, proximity, figured ground, symmetry and order, and then a lot of them tie together to make Pregnan's theory. Okay, next video, we'll look at the assignment.